Greetings, Montana, and hello, world. Chris Hislop from the Montana World Affairs Council with another in our series of International Careers Week, where we have heard you across the state in the classrooms and communities when asking our many distinguished speakers, how did you get the job that you do? And so in order to answer that, we have put together a dizzying array of international experts all week, Monday through Thursday, 8:30 a.m. to 2, to bring to Montana schools, to bring to our universities and our communities a little bit of insight into how these great professionals, both here in Montana, in the United States, and around the world, have got the jobs that they do and what they do and how they do it. So this is a tremendous week for us, and we are extremely happy to bring that to you. Very quickly, let me thank our good friends at the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, First Interstate Bank, Trail West Bank, QFI, High Stakes Foundation, and the Longview Foundation, who help us bring this and so many more great programs to classrooms and communities across Montana. Now I am so happy to introduce good friend and longtime partner of the Montana World Affairs Council, Deena Mansour, who's the executive director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center at the University of Montana. Since 2010, Deena has successfully brought in significant funding to the Mansfield Center to support the international exchange programs of more than 1,000 Montana and international students and professionals. She served as a consultant for the State Department throughout Asia and has lectured at a number of foreign universities. She also develops leadership programs across the globe, from Women's Leadership Initiative here at to sports diplomacy programs for marginalized populations in Latin America. She's worked or studied in nearly 40 countries, that's 40 countries, and has studied Indonesian, Arabic, and French. Deena, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. And it's my honor to join you today, Chris. Thanks for the phenomenal work you do to help support internationalization in Montana.
Well, we can't do it without you and the Mansfield Center and so many people who support us. Thanks for coming on, Deena. Now, we've got a lot to talk about because preceding you, of course, we've had a number of very interesting guests talk about the different types of work that one can do internationally, which does not, of course, always mean that one must live and work outside of the United States. So we've got a really interesting and varied perspective on what it is to do this kind of work, what it means, and where one can do it. And Deena, in the run up to this, I thought it's so interesting to get your perspectives on a number of things, not the least of which is the topic of this discussion, which is how Montana roots are an advantage in an international career, which I couldn't agree with more, but I do sometimes get the sense that people may feel that's not necessarily an advantage. But I wonder if you could give us some of your insight into that question, and then let's see where the conversation flows. Over to you, Deena.
Okay, well, that sounds great. And, I'll tell you that as I was growing up in small towns across America, in Oxford, Mississippi, Indianola, Iowa, Laramie, Wyoming, I never thought that I would have a career in public diplomacy and international education. But those experiences in these smaller towns, and certainly in the West and Laramie, Wyoming, gave me the perspective I needed to truly appreciate that global perspective, rather than being isolationist and focusing just squarely on my own community. How do we recognize that what happens here in Montana impacts people around the world, and what happens in global security issues impacts here in Montana? And there is no better example of that than the Chinese balloon that was seen floating over Montana. And I don't know if some of your earlier speakers have addressed that at all, Chris.
No one's addressed it squarely, but everybody has mentioned it as exactly this example of, hey, look, the world is all around and very near us, and how to engage therein.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I do have a brief PowerPoint presentation I'd like to share at some point, but what I just really want to make clear is that You don't have to come from an international minded background to be successful in international education. And it is exactly what Montana youth bring to the table that international organizations like the State Department, like World Wildlife Fund, these organizations are looking for in terms of geographic diversity and the strengths you bring to the table given your local knowledge here. And we find that time and time again in our program. So I really appreciate if there are teachers and students that are looking at this presentation and want to learn more about how to go down that international career path.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, as I said, this is the place to be this week if you have this interest in an international career path, whether that is from here in Missoula, like you and I do, or in some other way. So it's fascinating. Now, Deena, I know that you'll run a slideshow, but I wanted to just pick up on one thing you said there, because I know you have a very unique insight into this, which is, the Mansfield Center's programs help us understand why things matter in the world. It's happening a million miles away, and we can feel like, well, it doesn't matter to us, it doesn't affect us. But we learn through your programs that, hey, wait a second, this has a very immediate and direct effect. Now, people who are watching this are also interested in that. Could you give your insight here, Deena? How do we do that? How do we learn better how something like the very tragic earthquake in Turkey this morning, the situation in Ukraine, the situation between China and Taiwan, how do these affect us as we're sitting in here in Montana? But how do we learn that? How do we tease that out?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question, because if you read, when I took the Foreign Service exam to become a diplomat, I was told that the best way you can prepare is to read the major media, to keep abreast of what's happening through the New York Times or the Economist or things like that. So one, I'd say you need to be very clearly focused on news about what's happening in the world. And I know that, for example, my own kids, when they were in high school, they're in college now, they would have news updates pop up on their phone because teachers had encouraged them to do that, that they knew things that were going on in the world, like the earthquake or like the Chinese balloon. But at the core of it is really what students are learning in the classroom and how teachers guide them to understanding US priorities, that there is something that every president puts out called our national security strategy. And the Biden administration recently put out their most recent national security strategy in October. And that strategy lays out very clearly why international relations matters to Americans here at home, for our economic security, for our physical security, for global relations and building partnerships. And all of that relates to us here in Montana, because it relates to the price of gas at the gas station. It relates to the cost of bread on the shelves. It relates to Montana farmers selling their wheat to partners in Korea and Japan. So there are so many things that impact us here at home in terms of our security, in terms of our paycheck, in terms of how Americans can travel freely around the world. So everything that happens has that impact. And you see that very clearly in environmental issues, that when there are environmental tragedies that happen across the world, those impact us right here in Montana. And you see that in terms of forest fires, in terms of the glaciers melting away in Glacier National Park, in terms of invasive species. All of these things that are happening in Montana have some root in something that could happen 10,000 miles away.
Yeah, here. And I think you and I would both add the President's State of the Union address tonight as a great way to tune in a little bit to how America is engaged in the world and how events out there affect us here. Deena, would you like to run that slideshow?
Sure, great. Let me share my screen and I will try to go as quickly as possible. Do you see that, Chris?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the Mansfield Center, to talk about my own background and talk about why this work matters so deeply. And I go back to the motto that the University of Montana has in terms of thinking creatively, thinking critically, exploring creatively, and living ethically. And this is something that relates very much to a career in international affairs, but obviously this relates to any career that you choose. But this is at the very foundation of how you can be successful as an international affairs professional. And why does it matter? As we mentioned, international engagement is an integral part of our national security. So when you foster globally minded leaders of integrity, you work on strengthening democracy here at home, that is strengthening foreign governments and elements that are like-minded. And you see this, for example, in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. If we're strengthening democracy in Ukraine and Russia, that is less of an impact if you have two democratic nations there in terms of our budget and our involvement in that conflict. So I'll talk a little bit more about my own background. I mentioned that I lived in small towns across the country, but my parents actually emigrated from Egypt. Both of them came to the United States to seek a better life for me as their only child. I was born here in the US. But this slide of Louis Armstrong playing music in the midst of a bunch of Egyptian children really personifies to me that joy of international engagement, that here he is, a Black man going to a different culture, playing his jazz music, something that these children are not used to, and they can't understand the words that might come out of his lips, but they can understand the music. And so that's what I would also encourage you, is don't feel daunted by not speaking language that someone else across the table is speaking, perhaps. And I'll talk a little bit more about how you could be part of that through our sports diplomacy programs, where we use sports as an international language, where you could travel to some place like Chile or Honduras and not need to speak Spanish, but to engage in international relations yourself. So as I mentioned, my parents came to the United States. They came to pursue their education and perhaps get advantages that were just simply not possible in the Egypt of 1966, and quite frankly are not possible in today's Egypt either. We lived in small towns. This is Jubilee Days in Laramie, Wyoming. And they had a host family. They had some farmers that were host to them. And again, here's an issue of cross-cultural communication, that my parents were Muslim. Muslims are forbidden to eat pork, and yet they were hosted by Iowa pig farmers. Despite that conflict, they were able to develop a long relationship that lasted over 50 years. This is me and my children visiting my Egyptian family in 2012 in Alexandria, also bridging those divides, very different cultures in where I lived in Laramie, Wyoming, where my family lived in the metropolis of Cairo or Alexandria, Egypt, and yet how much we have in common across those borders, not to feel daunted by people whose lives are very different than your own. But that was my trajectory, that I decided to go to college in Washington, D.C. at American University, which has some fantastic scholarships for students who are interested in studying international relations. And this is another example of how being from Montana can advantage you, that the vast majority of people who apply to study at American University are from the East Coast. And to be from Montana, to have a demonstrated interest in international affairs, and to apply to someplace like American University is something that's very special and unique. And then I leveraged that experience studying at American University. As I mentioned, I took the Foreign Service exam, I passed, and I was assigned to live and work in Jakarta, Indonesia for 4 years. And this is an example of the kind of work that I did. One day I might be working at the embassy behind tall gates. The next day I could be at a Muslim boarding school where this group of students had never before met someone from the United States. But now we have global reach. You know, I was a diplomat, but I realized that I could have more impact here in Montana that I could have in the Foreign Service. And I loved living overseas. And I encourage all of you to take an opportunity to travel overseas in some capacity. Maybe you're going to study in high school, maybe you'll study abroad in university. There are funded opportunities to do that, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but please feel free to contact us here at the Mansfield Center if you have more questions. I left the Foreign Service and came to Montana. The reason I came to Montana is because my husband came to the University of Montana Law School to study Native American law. And so he works with Indigenous groups in Montana. I came to the Mansfield Center as one of the few organizations doing international work. And now we work with more than 60 countries around the world where high school students like you can be involved virtually through Mansfield Center programs. So you do not have to be in Missoula to take advantage of these programs that Chris offers, obviously, or that we offer. So we have a lot of different things. You know, I was asked when I was preparing for this to talk about what my work is like on a day-to-day basis. And it is very different day to day. This is a program that we put together where students can study abroad in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam for 3 weeks and compare and contrast the different environmental impacts that are happening in our countries from very different contexts, a tropical context to Montana's northern climates. We are all suffering from issues of food security, of drought, of fire. This is another example of what I do, excuse me, working with international professionals who come to Montana, who learn about the unique things that we have to offer here. And again, in your towns, there are many things that you have that are not offered anywhere else in terms of expertise on workforce development, on agriculture, on natural resource management. There are many things that we have here in Montana which are special that you cannot find anyplace else. For example, here at the University of Montana, we have the #1 wildlife biology program in the country. And people from around the world come here to learn about what we do that is so special. Every day I'm meeting with different people. This is Senator Tester meeting with some of our groups. I'm meeting with Indigenous groups across Montana. I'm taking people from non-governmental organizations and business to travel the world. I'm working with local communities and connecting Montanans with international visitors. And then this is one of our sports diplomacy programs. And again, I'd encourage you, if you're interested in the opportunity to go to Chile or Honduras for 10 days, using sports as a mechanism to engage with others, that you don't need to speak Spanish to participate in this program. You do have to have some engagement with the sport. It could be soccer, it could be basketball, it could be volleyball. It depends on what our country is at that time. But this is a way to reach across divides and engage with people using something like music or sport as a common language. We also work with people from marginalized or underrepresented communities that in a lot of countries around the world, if you're born with a disability, you don't have the opportunity to go to school. You're basically kept at home with no potential future outside that home, no career, no developing a partnership. But this is something that we do here in Montana with our programs, is we connect underrepresented communities to help develop their full potential. We, as I mentioned, engage the national security strategy. Some of our programs were developed by President Obama, President Trump, and now President Biden directly to engage with our participants. This is someone that we brought to Montana from Myanmar, who was then able to travel to the White House and meet with President Obama. And then, of course, we engage in K-12 schools, because it's not just for you as high school students, but to start even at the kindergarten level to get people involved in international engagement is really critical to develop a lifelong way of thinking globally. As I mentioned, we fund high school students on international travel. This student here is a Hellgate High School student who traveled to Thailand on one of our programs, fully funded, and he spent a week with a student partner in a Muslim boarding school. And then we do bring high school groups to the University of Montana. We have a program called Innovate where you're able to come in, learn about the innovations that we have in international programs and democracy, and gather with other students from across the state. So hopefully we can reach out to your school for that next year. It's all about making connections. It's about engaging with people. And so that's pretty much my slideshow. Thank you, Chris, for letting me go very quickly through all of that. And I hope I've answered some of the questions, but happy to take more questions.
Thank you so much, Deena. We are so lucky to have you and others come on this week, giving these incredible perspectives. But let's not forget, we've got all of these incredible Montana students who have these extraordinary questions, and they're rolling in now, Deena, for you. So I'm receiving them via the chat. I'll curate them a bit and send them your way. A lot of really interesting questions from all across the state. Um, the first question coming from Bozeman High School. Other than mainstream media, what unique perspectives does local media offer on both domestic and international scales? I think this is coming off your point of staying attuned to the news.
Yeah, well, I think this is a great point, and I think that there is something of very global interest, like the Chinese balloon, and I'll talk about that, or there's something that is very dialed down into what we're doing to make a difference in our home community. So let me talk about the Chinese balloon. So when this balloon was found by a Billings news reporter and photographed and amplified to the world, questions were pouring into the Mansfield Center because we are known, based on Ambassador Mansfield's legacy, for being a center of Asia expertise. So you may not know that even though our national intelligence apparatus knew that this balloon was over Montana, they had not made it public. And it did not get public until this Billings photographer amplified it to the world. So that is a great example of a local photographer getting involved in global affairs. But we have a China expert here, Tiff Roberts, who worked and lived in Beijing for 20 years, working for Bloomberg News. And so he talked to a lot of people who said, should we take what China says at face value, that this is just a weather balloon, this is just gathering research? And he said, absolutely not. And he was able to provide that context to Montanans about how Montana is so critical in our national defense. We have Malmstrom Air Force Base here. Many of you know that we have one of the highest number of military members in the military and veterans per capita in the country. And to talk about what the Chinese have to learn from Montana. They're very interested in our agricultural production. They're very interested in our military. They're very interested in how rural America has an impact on U.S. foreign policy. So there's a lot to be gained by Chinese just coming in and asking seemingly innocuous questions that they're utilizing to help in their own Chinese defense strategy. So I think that's a great example of how we can talk from a local perspective on global issues. But I'll also say that here in Missoula, we frequently have coverage of our international participants. For example, I will be traveling to Taiwan in March on a Fulbright Award, and I encourage you all to learn about Fulbright Awards for when you're in university. There's lots of opportunities for you to travel overseas, fully funded on a Fulbright. But I'm going to Taiwan to develop opportunities for Montanans to either learn Mandarin Chinese, to study abroad in Taiwan, perhaps to participate in a cultural exchange. So a local newspaper did a story on me to talk about why is Taiwan important and how can Montanans get involved. So I know a lot of students that come to the University of Montana host international visitors in their home. And I think a lot of the news media really like to talk about that people-to-people engagement right there in your home as well. A lot of the reason that the US government does this is because it's the law that in 1961, we were in the midst of the Cold War and we were investing so much of the US budget on weapons of destruction. And very wisely, people in our Congress said, as much as we invest in weapons of destruction, maybe we should also be investing in weapons of peace, not even weapons, instruments of peace. And so the Fulbright-Hays Act was passed to say that the US government must spend the taxpayer dollar on people-to-people relations. And so that's why the US Department of State spends $700 million a year to develop programs for high school students, university students, and professionals. So obviously, mutual understanding, people-to-people relations, that's something that our local media should be covering and should care very much about.
Deena, I'm just going to quickly echo what you said about the Mansfield Center. So for those of you who are watching, and if this resonates with you, please, as Deena suggested, go to the Mansfield Center website to get more information. It's not only for University of Montana students. I mean, all across Montana, there are opportunities for high school students and others to engage in the world through the Mansfield Center. I'd encourage you to check that out. Deena, here's another question from our high school students. How does growing up interacting more with the environment and seeing direct impacts of climate policy and climate change add to your ability to interact in international policy?
Well, that is a great question because I see so often in my work when I'm working with someone maybe based in Vietnam working to save the pangolins, or I'm working with someone in Indonesia working on recycling projects. You know, a lot of these Americans overseas started out as high school students working on their own projects, maybe recycling projects, maybe hunting and fishing, maybe hiking every day out their backyard. And that experience gives you a special perspective that you just can't get in a city. So I often see that when you have that experience, that you can use that to form your university experience, but you can also use that to form your next jobs, that people are looking for people like you. You know, there's the Montana, what is it? It's Montana Conservation, MCC. What is that called, Chris?
I'm not sure.
There is something where you can get a summer paid internship helping Montana Conservation something, MCC, and you're paid and you're out there breaking trails and you're out there cleaning up campgrounds. And this is the kind of experience that people say, wow, this person knows how to work. This person knows how to be out in the outdoors. They know how to engage with wildlife. They know how to engage with people who care about the outdoors. And that kind of person is highly valued in a career. Oh, thank you. Montana Conservation Corps. That is it,
Yeah,
Kevin.
you
Thank
got
you.
that? Okay. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Kevin. I'm just going to punch in the website too for anybody who's interested in following up on that as another very interesting and unique opportunity. Deena, I'm going to touch a little bit on, going back to the advantage of being Montanan, and you mentioned it a couple times, and let's talk about this, that the sense that it might be a bit daunting. People might feel like, well, the East Coasters, or there's this or that. But I'd like to kind of hit that thing head on. There's a question that's coming in from one of our students, but I think that we should lead into this a bit. The question is, do you need an international relations degree to go into the Foreign Service? That's question one. Let me expand that question a little bit and get your views on what do you think, Deena, in terms of an international career? What kinds of academic studies or practical experiences or qualities and characteristics are important?
Well, I love that that student brought that up because that is such a great question. That absolutely not. You do not need a degree in international affairs to successfully be selected to be in the Foreign Service or to be successful as a Foreign Service officer. The Foreign Service is looking for a diversity of backgrounds in every way. So let me first start with the major. They want people that can be good at economics, at IT, at administration and business, certainly understanding cross-cultural development. So there is no degree that is not relevant for the Foreign Service. So I really encourage you to look at the Foreign Service regardless of what you study in college. I will also say that in terms of diversity of backgrounds, that students from Montana, again, are highly sought. Like that's not to say that you're going to get picked if you applied for an internship right off the bat. But let me tell you, for example, there is an internship opportunity through the State Department that is available to lower income families. And this is a really incredible opportunity because they pay you, I think they pay $17 an hour. They pay for your housing, they pay for your airfare. Year one, the summer is spent 10 weeks in Washington, D.C. Year 2, the second summer, is spent 10 weeks overseas at an embassy. So this is for college students. You do not have to be studying international affairs. You do have to have some kind of interest, demonstrated interest in foreign affairs. And that's why acting on this as a high school student is really important. And that doesn't mean traveling overseas, but being involved in the Montana World Affairs Council programs, being involved in Academic World Quest, doing Model UN, hosting an international visitor in your home for dinner and demonstrating an interest in their country. But to be from Montana, that's underrepresented. That most people that join the Foreign Service are from the 5 big universities in Washington, D.C., and that does not represent who we are as a people. So to bring in people from Montana and the Rocky Mountain West is really important so that the diplomatic service accurately represents the people of the United States. So you can study anything you like. You should demonstrate an interest in international affairs. It can't just come out of nowhere, right? It's better if you study a language, though the Foreign Service will train you in a language. And that's one of the things I loved about being in the Foreign Service, that after I was assigned to Indonesia, 9 months of my life was spent doing nothing but studying Indonesian language. So if that sounds horrible to you, you should not apply for the Foreign Service. But it was a really wonderful luxury to get paid to study a language. What are the other characteristics? You know, my earlier slide, think critically, engage creatively, be ethical. Those are the 3 key things: to think critically. And I know, you know, my kids went to Hellgate High School and studied the IB curriculum. They did not get the IB diploma, but what I love about IB is that it really teaches you to think critically. So to me, that's what the State Department needs, and that's what you need to practice doing in your own life, is how do you become an independent, inquisitive thinker? The core of all of this is a foundation of ethics and integrity. When you are representing the US government overseas, you must act with complete integrity, openness, transparency, and honesty. These are all critical components to being successful and engaging with people overseas. You know, you may have challenges of language, but if they are suspicious about your intent and what you stand for, you are not going to get anywhere. And I think, you know, just to be a really a hard worker and not feel entitled about where you are, but to feel appreciative of where you are. You know, Chris has probably had this experience working overseas as well, but there are different kinds of expats, Americans who live overseas. There are those who really delve into the local community, that they get out there on the public transportation, they're eating in the local food stalls, they make local friends, they're appreciative of the opportunity. And, you know, it's hard. You're not going to like Italy and sitting, you know, at the, I don't know, at the Vatican eating pasta all day long. Living overseas is hard. The challenges of communication, the culture shock, being with different people, and you've got to learn to love that, or you've got to feel intrinsically that that is where you belong. So to not feel entitled and feel this level of elitism because you're from this powerful country, but to appreciate that every country has a seat at the table, every culture has something that is valuable about it, and to really appreciate and be curious about what that is.
Deena, that's such a great point. And it's been interesting this morning because everybody we've been talking to this morning has brought this idea up in one way or another, which is, you know, the interest and the wonder of human interaction as part of this conversation, of part of, we're talking about international careers, and that can maybe get lost in this idea of job and salary and what have you not. But everybody, and yourself included, has come back to these, you know, more personal, more human interaction focused things, which is really at the core of this being able to live and work and engage in an international career, because it is the world after all, and it's a group of diverse people with diverse values and beliefs and languages. And so I was very glad to hear it. Now I'm going to share very briefly a quick story, which is going to give you time to think of a story, because we've gotten these really cool stories, but about this kind of the idea of human interaction, and I'm going to pick up on the daunting thing as well. Sure, it is daunting to go out there in the world. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Kyrgyzstan, and in Kyrgyzstan, the honored guest at a dinner receives the boiled head of the sheep, of course, and you can't duck that one. If you're the honored guest, you must accept it. And it's a bit daunting and it's a bit scary, and you're not sure what to do, and you're not speaking the language well. But you know, you kind of enter into that space. You engage with your curiosity and some adventurism, and you find out that those people who are around you who may not you may not be communicating well, you're all humans and you're all enjoying at the same table, and you're all living in this place and you're in each other's company, which really counts for so much when we talk about these extraordinary international experiences and opportunities that you described too. All right, Deena, now I wonder if you might share with us any kind of story that from your life, from your international career, that really highlights this idea of human interaction.
Yeah, no, that's great. Well, I will tell you that when you are overseas, it is kind of this crucible. I mean, it's wonderful and stressful, and it is like nothing you've ever experienced. And, certainly this is something that you can have in terms of cross-cultural engagement here in Montana. Like, I know many people who have lived from a small Montana town in Missoula, and there is that similar culture shock and an engaging. But I will tell you that I lived in Indonesia from 1994 to 1997. And the people that I met in Indonesia are still my closest friends. I mean, that was like almost 30 years ago, right? But we still keep in touch because it was just such an intensity of experience. So I'll tell you about my husband, actually. So when we moved to Indonesia, we were not married. We'd been dating for about a year. We actually met freshman year of college at American University and lived on the same floor of the dorm, but did not start dating for 7 more years. But once we started dating, I was about to go off to Indonesia. So he said, okay, I'll come along. But he was from a small town in Michigan, I think maybe 4,000 people, maybe 12,000 people, small town in Michigan. And he had actually studied international affairs, but he had never really been overseas other than a 2-week high school trip to Paris. So when he came, he was very concerned that he could not accurately protect us when we were out in the streets, that he was out in this place where he couldn't speak the local language, the Indonesian, and he kind of felt like tense all the time. So it was really hard for him to adjust. But at the end of our time in Indonesia, he had done more extreme things than I had, because I was working at the US Embassy and I had my Indonesian friends, but he was working in an Indonesian business. And so his Indonesian friends would take him home for the weekend. And in Indonesia, in more rural areas, it's not normal to have toilet paper. It's not normal to use toilet paper in most rural areas, right? So in Indonesia, you use your left hand when you have to go to the bathroom and you don't have toilet paper. And so in Indonesia, you never use your left hand to touch other people or to pass food, because this is the bathroom hand. This is the non-bathroom hand. So he went to a friend's house and had to go to the bathroom, and there was no toilet paper. And he had to use his left hand, which, for an American is very unusual and shocking to get that close to your fecal matter, right? You just don't do that. You usually have this nice, pristine border, but isn't that so much better for the environment if we didn't use toilet paper? On that same trip, he had to eat the lung of a bat. It was crispy. It was kind of like a cracker, but it was lung. And it was something that he had never experienced before, but he just got right in there and he ate the bat lung and he wiped with his left hand. And these are the stories we remember 25 years later.
Yeah, absolutely. I love it. Thanks a lot, Deena, for sharing that. I mean, that is a real life story. And it really highlights this idea of, for those of you who are watching, where these kinds of things, curiosity and adventure and, experiencing something different, if that resonates with you, then clearly there may be a path for you in an international career, wherever that may be. So before signing off here, I would like to quickly once again thank the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Allegiance, First Interstate Bank, Trail West Bank, QFI, the High Stakes Foundation, and Longview Foundation, who help us bring this and many more programs to you. Deena Mansour from the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center at the University of Montana. Thank you once again. You've been on many of our shows and you've been supporting our programs for years. Thanks for that support, but coming here today and giving us your very special and unique insight into international careers. Do you want to leave with any final thoughts?
My only thought is that if this is the kind of life that sounds attractive to you, you can absolutely pursue it. There is nothing stopping you. I have seen students come from all over Montana and successfully gain some kind of international experience, and that you have a lot of people here to support you. Your teachers, the Montana World Affairs Council, the Mansfield Center. And I encourage you to pursue your dream, whether it's in international affairs or anything.
Couldn't agree with you more. That is a great way to leave off today, Deena. Thank you for that. Very quickly, tomorrow, if you're interested in the United Nations, or maybe you've got an interest in international law, international diplomacy, becoming an international teacher or educator, or in the World Wildlife Fund, tomorrow is your day here at International Careers Week. Come and check us out 8:30 to 2 o'clock. The detailed schedule is available on our website. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Deena, thank you once again for your insight and perspective. Everybody, be well. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.